Introduction. When the first Rothschild volume ends, the family looks almost untouchable. They have survived revolutions, turned information into power, and built the closest thing 19th century Europe had to a private international financial system. So it is tempting to assume the second half of the story will just be more of the same. More wealth, more influence, more proof that the machine keeps running. But that is not really how the House of Rothschild, the world's banker, begins. It opens on a quieter danger. The revolutions of 1848 do not destroy the Rothschilds financially, they threaten the family system itself. The founders are aging. The next generation is larger, more comfortable, and spread across different countries with different political interests. At the same time, telegraphs are eroding the old information edge, nationalism is redrawing loyalties, imperial finance is moving beyond Europe, and the center of global money is starting to drift away from the cities they know best. That is what makes this volume so interesting. The first book is about how the Rothschilds became powerful. The second is about what it takes to stay powerful once the environment changes. It is about inheritance, technology, politics, empire, anti-Semitism, and the difference between absolute success and relative decline. And the book matters for another reason, too. The lazy version of Rothschild history is all myth. Secret omnipotence, shadow control, endless conspiracy. Ferguson's version is more interesting because it is more concrete. He shows a family that was staggeringly effective but never magical, rich but never insulated from history. So in this episode, I want to follow the second half of the arc in the same spirit as the Part 1 review, not as a dry chapter recap, but as a story about what changed, what stayed the same, and what this family really teaches once it is no longer rising but trying to hold together a multinational dynasty in an age getting faster, harsher, and much more national. After 1848, the weak point was the family. The first big surprise in this book is that the Rothschilds do not come out of 1848 looking invincible. Financially, they survive. Structurally, though, 1848 exposes the more dangerous problem, succession. It is easy to forget, after spending so much time with the first generation, that by 1850 the surviving sons of Meyer Amschel are old men. Amschel is 77, Salomon is 76. Karl is 62 and unwell. Only James, at 56, still has something like the old energy. That matters because the Rothschild empire was never just a pile of money, it was a living family mechanism. Brothers writing to brothers, cousins backing cousins, houses rescuing other houses when markets froze. Once that mechanism depends on nephews and cousins who did not build it from scratch, the risk changes. The danger is no longer simply, can the firm survive a panic? It becomes, can the family still think and act like one house? What really matters here is that Ferguson does not explain Rothschild's survival after 1848 by saying they were just richer than everyone else. He puts huge weight on James in Paris. James becomes the bridge figure, the uncle who connects old discipline to new ambition, the man who can still bind increasingly different branches back together. In one of the key letters from this period, he basically says what every family firm knows but rarely says out loud: it is much easier to break something apart than to put it back together. That line gets to the core of the whole Rothschild method. Unity is not a sentimental value here. It is an operating system. The reason the five-house arrangement had worked so brilliantly in the earlier decades was that the different branches could absorb shocks for one another. Britain in trouble? Paris helps. Paris in trouble? London helps. Vienna near collapse? The others write off losses and keep the name standing. The market trusted Rothschild precisely because it did not mean one isolated office. It meant a clan that could mobilize capital, credit, and reputation across borders. They keep marriage inside the family at a striking rate. Between 1848 and 1877, there are 9 marriages within the clan, and the point is obvious. Keep capital from scattering, keep loyalties aligned, keep the branches bound together not just by contracts, but by blood. They are trying to preserve a confederation that cannot easily be regulated from above because it exists in several states, several legal systems, and several political cultures at once. The same is true of the culture of deference to the house. The younger generation is not allowed to think of itself as a set of unrelated heirs. It is expected to inherit a collective machine. The letters are full of irritation, rivalry, ego, and complaints, but obligation remains real long after warmth becomes uneven. Lionel and the long fight to enter Parliament. If James is the key figure for keeping the family together after 1848, Lionel is the key figure for changing what the Rothschild name means in public. This is one of the themes I found most compelling in the book, because it takes the Rothschild story beyond finance and into something larger: political status, Jewish emancipation, and public legitimacy. Lionel's decision to stand for Parliament in 1847 is treated by Ferguson as a real watershed, and I think that is exactly right. Nathan and his wife had already been involved in the struggle to end Jewish exclusion from Parliament much earlier, but Lionel makes it personal. He becomes the candidate, the test case, the man whose success or exclusion will say something not just about one family, but about whether a Jew can fully enter British public life at all. What follows is not a quick triumph. It is a long, exhausting, almost humiliating fight. Lionel is elected, but because the parliamentary oath still contains specifically Christian language, he cannot simply walk in and take his seat on equal terms. So, for years, the issue drags on through elections, debates, public pressure, and legal change. He keeps fighting, the family keeps watching, and finally, in 1858, after more than a decade of political and symbolic struggle, the barrier breaks and he is able to sit. To the rest of the family, this is not just another social advancement. It is treated as a victory for Jews well beyond England. James sees Lionel's fight as part of the same long battle that Meyer Amschel had fought in a totally different environment for dignity and standing. Other relatives describe it as the beginning of a new era for Jews more broadly. That reaction matters because it tells us something important about how the Rothschilds saw themselves. A lazy reading would say, of course, they wanted seats in Parliament because that would increase their business influence. But by the 1840s and 1850s, they already had enormous financial leverage. What they wanted was legitimacy, the kind money alone cannot buy. This is a recurring pattern in the Rothschild story. They become indispensable to rulers long before they become fully accepted by society. They can lend to governments before they can fully belong to the political nation. Lionel's parliamentary campaign is one of the clearest moments where that contradiction is pushed into the open. Britain is willing to trust Rothschild capital, but it takes much longer to accept a Rothschild oath. Lionel's political rise matters because he is not just another banker with connections. He becomes a public symbol. In a way, the family stops being merely the bankers of rulers and starts becoming a visible part of the political order itself. But there is a cost to that visibility too. The more public they become, the less they can operate in the old semi-private mode of pure discretion. They are now watched not just by clients and rivals, but by newspapers, electorates, satirists, and people who increasingly use the Rothschilds as shorthand for the whole relationship between money, modernity, Jews, and power. So Lionel's victory opens a door. It does not remove the hostility outside the door. How the house reproduced itself. One of the smartest things in this book is the way it shows that the Rothschilds did not survive by accident between generations. They reproduced themselves very deliberately. Start with education. The Rothschild children are not raised in the narrow, single country way you might expect from national elites. Their education remains cosmopolitan for most of the 19th century. They rely heavily on private tutors. They spend substantial periods abroad. Above all, they are expected to remain multilingual. That detail is more important than it sounds. Language in the Rothschild world is not just a social accomplishment, it is infrastructure. A multilingual child is a future cross-border operator, and the family is realistic about what elite institutions can and cannot do. Universities may confer Polish and contacts, but they do not teach Rothschild banking. If you want to learn that, you learn it in a bank. This is why the family keeps producing people who can move between countries more easily than most aristocrats or ministers. The Rothschild children are being raised not just to belong to one nation, but to function inside a network that sits across nations. And then we come to the houses themselves, which are one of the most revealing parts of the book. On the surface, the giant houses, chateaux, town palaces, and estates look like classic signs of conquest by money. The family is buying scale, art, land, social prestige, and aristocratic lifestyle. That is true. But if you stop there, you miss the more interesting function. These houses are not just homes. They are operating platforms, advertisements for Rothschild power, private galleries, political salons, elite guest houses, and business infrastructure all at once. In an age before modern luxury hotels and constant secure travel, influential visitors often stay in private homes. So, a Rothschild house becomes a place where politicians, financiers, diplomats, artists, and clients can be hosted in a way that blends intimacy with spectacle. That matters because social life is part of information flow. Once ministers, princes, writers, and businessmen are circulating through your rooms, you are not just spending money on decoration, you are buying access, status confirmation, and informal intelligence. This is also where the family starts looking much more aristocratic from the outside. They collect art, sponsor culture, hunt, race horses, and host lavish gatherings. But even here, the book is too subtle to reduce everything to vanity. These are part of how financial capital becomes social permanence. And yet there is a tension running through all of this. The more the Rothschilds assimilate into elite European society, the more they risk losing the original severity that built the house. That is why the family keeps leaning on its own internal mechanisms. It is not enough for the children to be elegant, they have to be useful. When the telegraph levels the field, if part 1 was full of couriers, coded letters, and fast private networks, part 2 introduces the technology that starts to flatten that edge, the telegraph. This is one of my favorite transitions in the whole Rothschild saga, because it shows so clearly how an advantage dies. For decades, the family made money not just by having capital, but by hearing things first. Then the wires spread. James complained that the telegraph is ruining our business, and he was basically right. Once telegraphy became commercially useful after 1848, rivals could start coordinating across distance and reacting faster to market news. The old monopoly on speed weakened, but the family still had one major advantage: the telegraph was not yet truly global. There was no link from Europe to North America or India until 1866, to Latin America until 1869, or to Australia until 1873. Outside wired Europe, the world was still slow, and in those slow zones the Rothschild network still mattered enormously, so the edge changed rather than vanished. They were less uniquely fast, but still uniquely distributed. The advantage became less "we here first," and more "we can still move money, trust, and credit across borders better than almost anyone else." Peace talk, war profit. Another thing this book does very well is puncture the sentimental idea that the Rothschilds were simply men of peace. They had good reasons to prefer peace. War could wreck budgets, scare investors, and destabilize the diplomatic order they depended on. James even hoped weak markets might pressure rulers into restraint. But from Crimea through the wars of Italian and German unification, the family discovered that short wars could also be extremely profitable for a multinational house built to move capital across borders. That is one of the sharpest corrections in the volume. Ferguson argues that the Rothschilds had overstated the dangers of war. Not every war, obviously, but the conflicts of 1854 to 1871 often produced exactly the borrowing, transfer work, and spread opportunities their system was built for. You can see the contradiction in the Ottoman and Papal cases. The idea of turning Turkey's national bank into something close to a Rothschild appendage sounds wild, but it shows how large their reputation had become. And in the Vatican, anti-Jewish rhetoric coexisted with financial dependence. That is the point. The family could be denounced culturally and needed financially at the same time. So, the real picture is not peaceful bankers. It is a multinational family that talked peace, profited from shorter wars, and became more entangled than ever in national power. Empire by prospectus. This is the phase where the family stops looking merely European and starts looking unmistakably global. That does not mean they abandon Europe. The great continental markets still matter enormously, but as the century advances, British and French capital increasingly pushes into extra-European worlds, and the Rothschilds move with it. They are not always first into every opportunity. In fact, one of the themes of the book is that they are often more cautious than later legend suggests. But once a market is large enough, strategic enough, and financeable enough, they have a way of getting involved. The best-known example is Egypt and the Suez Canal. Everyone knows the romantic version of the story. Disraeli needs money fast in 1875 to buy the Khedive's shares in the canal company, and Rothschild capital makes it happen. That basic outline is true. The London house advances £4 million to the British government, allowing the Crown to move quickly and secure a major stake in one of the most strategically important assets in the world. The Rothschilds had often been cautious about Egypt and Ottoman finances before this moment. They were not blind imperial zealots charging forward at every colonial opportunity. They hesitated, doubted, refused, and assessed. The eventual Suez move therefore feels less like a master plan than like a decisive intervention once the political and strategic logic aligned. That is why Ferguson's phrase about something like multinational imperialism is so useful. The Rothschilds often preferred environments where economic interests were backed by more than one power, or where no single national ideology fully locked them in. As colonial rivalry sharpened, this became harder. British and French priorities diverged. Austrian interests were increasingly more provincial. National foreign policies started pulling the houses in different directions. Still, the family's extra-European reach grows. By the late 19th century, they have major positions not just in public debt, but in metals, mining, refining, and commodities that sit underneath industrial and imperial expansion. Gold, mercury, copper, lead, silver, diamonds, rubies, oil. By 1900, they are present in a remarkable spread of the non-ferrous and precious materials that lubricate global power. This is important because it complicates the stereotype of the Rothschilds as mere bond merchants. They never stop caring about sovereign debt, but increasingly they also sit closer to the material base of the global economy. The old bond market dynasty is now tied to the gold standard, precious metals, mining companies, and imperial resource systems. And yet, even in this globally powerful phase, the family is dealing with a subtle strategic problem. The more business becomes embedded in national imperial competition, the harder it becomes for a multinational family to act with complete unity. Empire expands their opportunities. It also increases the pressure that will eventually split their common system apart. The house starts to pull apart. This is, to me, one of the deepest themes in the entire book. The Rothschilds do not mainly lose ground because they suddenly become stupid or timid. They lose coherence because the world that once rewarded their multinational confederation starts to segment. For a long time, the family firm had turned geographical spread into strength. A London house, a Paris house, a Vienna house, Frankfurt roots, older habits of joint profit sharing. All of that gave them a flexibility no rival could easily match. But from the 1860s onward, the pressures pulling the branches apart become harder to ignore. Some of this is personal. Different partners have different appetites, different styles, different levels of ambition. That is normal in any large family. But Ferguson insists, rightly I think, that the main reason is structural. The European capital market itself becomes more segmented. The political consequences of the wars from 1859 to 1871 are huge. New nation-states and changing fiscal regimes alter the map. Meanwhile, British and French capital flows increasingly reorient toward markets beyond Europe. The branches are no longer simply working together inside one broad European game. They are being drawn into partially different games. And once that starts, local incentives become stronger than confederal loyalty. Each house develops closer informal partnerships in its own environment. In London, there are links with Barings and others in the city. In Paris, the haute banque matters. Vienna has its own institutional relationships. Germany changes too. Over time, the volume of business done with these local partners begins to exceed the old cross-border business done with other Rothschild houses. The letters show that the family understands the danger. Alphonse talks about tightening the ties between the houses. James insists that they must stick together, keep each other fully informed, and avoid each branch trying to draw everything to itself. In other words, the people inside the system can see the centrifugal force gathering. But seeing a structural problem is not the same thing as solving it. What used to make the Rothschilds so formidable was that they could think and operate beyond the nation. Now the nation is becoming harder to root around. Markets are more national, politics is more national, press cultures are more national, and imperial interests increasingly diverge. The family can preach unity, but French imperial calculations are not the same as British ones, and Austrian priorities are not the same as either. That is why the eventual end of the old partnership system feels so important. When the London, Paris, and Vienna houses become fully separate entities, Ferguson treats that as the real watershed in Rothschild history, and I think he is right. The world still sees Rothschild, but the old confederal mechanism that made that name uniquely powerful has, in a deep sense, ended. The tragedy is that this happens gradually enough that it does not feel like collapse at first. There is no single Waterloo in reverse moment. There is just a long process in which coordination becomes harder, localism becomes more rational, and the multinational family machine becomes less singular than it used to be. Decline without collapse. If you say only that they declined after 1880, you risk understating how powerful they still were. If you say only that they remained immensely wealthy and influential, you miss the real historical shift. The phrase that helps most is Ferguson's own. Decline is a relative concept. Relative to their commanding position earlier in the century, yes, the Rothschilds decline. They are less profitable than some newer rivals. They grow less quickly. Their individual wealth is no longer so uniquely dominant once the age of giant industrial fortunes arrives. They are slower to seize some of the most dynamic new opportunities, especially in America. But relative decline is not the same thing as irrelevance. The London House remains by far the largest private bank in the city. In some periods, it is not just the biggest private bank in London, but one of the biggest banks of any kind in the world. If you wanted a rough modern analogy for what the 19th century Rothschild system had once been, you would need a combination of several major Wall Street houses plus a slice of what institutions like the IMF later did for sovereign stabilization. That is not a minor player. So why does the family still look like it is fading? Part of the answer is strategic temperament. The Rothschilds had long operated on a principle that sounds almost unglamorous: do not chase excessive profits, keep clear limits, and spread resources across recurring operations rather than gambling everything on a few spectacular wins. That kind of discipline is one reason they last so long. It is also one reason they sometimes look stodgy next to faster-growing rivals. The family firm's time horizon matters here. A family business with living heirs and inherited reputation often thinks differently from a public company or a hard-charging newcomer. The goal is not simply to maximize return this year, it is to avoid ruin over generations. That trade-off becomes more visible in the late 19th century. The Rothschilds continue using handwritten letters astonishingly late. They often look conservative next to more aggressive rivals. They remain heavily engaged in public finance, gold, and overseas investment rather than throwing themselves with equal zeal into every domestic industrial boom. In one sense, that looks like slowness. In another, it looks like rational self-limitation. But there is also a real missed opportunity underneath all this: America. This is where the shadow of Part 1 hangs over Part 2. The family never truly built the American house it should have built. That omission did not seem fatal when London remained the unquestioned center of world finance. Once New York started pulling gravity westward, it became much more serious. You can already see the shift before 1914. In the Boer War era, Pierpont Morgan is becoming impossible to ignore. In American railways and securities, the Rothschilds never root themselves as deeply as they might have. By the time the 20th century arrives, the Great Atlantic Shift is underway. And still, even late in the century, their influence remains real. The Barings crisis is a good example. When Barings gets into severe trouble, the Rothschilds help avert a wider panic, and Natty's standing in official circles rises because of it. Declining houses do not usually help stabilize the system. Systemically important ones do. So the right reading is not they were finished. The right reading is they were still enormous, but they were no longer uniquely positioned to dominate the future. That is a much more interesting and useful kind of decline. The Jewish question never leaves the room. For all the titles, estates, parliamentary victories, and drawing room access the Rothschilds accumulate, one fact never goes away. They remain Jews in a Europe that repeatedly refuses to make Jewishness politically ordinary. This theme is everywhere in the book, and it gives the whole story a much deeper charge than a standard banking history would have. You can see it first in the family's own behavior. Since Meyer Amschel's time, one of the ways the Rothschilds try to mitigate hostility is through philanthropy, not only to Jewish causes but also to non-Jewish ones. That is not just generosity, though it includes real generosity. It is also a conscious strategy of acceptance. That is why Lionel's parliamentary victory mattered so much earlier. It was not only a constitutional question, it was proof that even the most established Jewish family in Britain still had to fight for full public inclusion. And as the century goes on, the family's Jewish identity acquires another layer: projection. Outsiders increasingly imagine the Rothschilds as people who might use their money to solve the Jewish question on a civilizational scale. Some fantasize that they could restore a Jewish kingdom in Palestine. Others treat them as natural leaders of world Jewry. In the East, in particular, the idea of Rothschild as a princely redeemer has real emotional force. The book is very good on the gap between projection and reality. The family is not a single-minded proto-Zionist command center. Its attitudes are mixed, often cautious, sometimes assimilationist, sometimes paternal, sometimes philanthropic, occasionally supportive of colonization projects, but rarely simple. They are too embedded in their own national societies and too divided internally to behave like one ideological bloc. That mixed stance matters later, in painful ways. By the interwar years, the family is facing Jewish refugee crises, Nazi pressure, and competing ideas about Palestine, resettlement, and what practical rescue might look like. Some proposals turn toward Palestine. Others look at places like Brazil, Sudan, Kenya, or elsewhere. That is not evidence of cold indifference so much as evidence of confusion, fragmentation, and the desperate search for a survivable answer in an increasingly murderous world. What really stayed with me is how little assimilation finally protects them from the return of raw anti-Semitism. After all the titles, after all the public service, after all the estates and collections and parliamentary seats, the family is still vulnerable to being cast back into the category Jew by regimes and movements that hate Jews more than they admire wealth. That is one of the hardest truths in the entire Rothschild story. Success can buy entry into elite society. It cannot guarantee permanent acceptance. When New York replaces London, the earlier family had risen in a world where Britain could finance coalitions, London could sit at the heart of international lending, and a house spread across major European capitals could sit at the center of interstate transfers. That was exactly the environment in which the Rothschild system had an almost unfair advantage. The First World War is the event that finally proves that environment is gone. This is one of the book's most important points. People sometimes assume that because war had helped launch the Rothschilds in the Napoleonic era, another great war should have been a similar opportunity. Ferguson's answer is basically no, because this is not the same kind of war and not the same financial world. In the Napoleonic age, Britain financed allies through transfers that a family with houses in the right places could help execute. In 1914 and after, the decisive fact is Britain's dependence on American credit. The key wartime financial relationship is no longer one the Rothschilds are ideally placed to mediate. It runs through New York, and J.P. Morgan becomes the linchpin. That is the long-feared American omission coming back with full force. The family had never built a true sixth house in the United States. Now that strategic choice turns out to matter enormously, and the war hurts them in many other ways too. The old cooperation with Vienna becomes effectively impossible. Links with German banks rupture, overseas trade is disrupted by panic, blockade, and submarine warfare. The gold standard, one of the great underlying structures of Rothschild business, stops functioning as convertibility is suspended and exchange controls spread. Progressive taxation bites deeper than before. Even where the family benefits in isolated ways from wartime demand, the net effect is negative. The most striking line in the book is the suggestion that what united the houses after 1914 was not renewed collective strength but shared decline. That sounds harsh, but it catches something real. The war changes the scale at which finance and state power interact. Merchant bank dynasties become less central to the management of total war. To be fair, the family does not disappear. The gold fix begins at New Court in 1919, which shows that the London house still occupies an important niche in the post-war monetary world. But that niche is no longer the same as commanding the global bond market. It is more specialized, more partial, and less politically central than what they once had. This is the point where the Rothschild story stops being the story of the world's banker in the singular and starts becoming the story of a great banking family trying to find defensible ground in a world of larger states, larger corporations, and increasingly American-centered finance. Exile, looting, and the end of the old world. If the First World War marks the weakening of the old Rothschild system, the Nazi era marks the moral and material destruction of the world in which that system had grown up. In Frankfurt, Maximilian is too old to leave and ends up reduced to occupying only a room in a house that had long symbolized the family's emancipation from the old confinements of Jewish life there. He is forced to sell the property at a grossly unjust price. After Kristallnacht, he is also compelled to part with his art collection and pay punitive exactions on what remains. The cruelty here is not only economic, it is historical. A family that had once marked its escape into civic air is pushed backward by the state into legal degradation. In Vienna, the violence is even more immediate. Louis is arrested and taken to the Hotel Metropole. Property confiscation begins almost at once. SS men loot artworks. Palaces become targets. Institutions founded by Rothschild money are seized. The point is not simply that Jewish wealth is stolen. The point is that the entire visible social presence of the family in Central Europe is being erased and redistributed. That matters because the Rothschilds had spent more than a century turning money into culture, architecture, philanthropy, collections, and public standing. Nazism attacks all of that at once. The family is not only dispossessed, it is symbolically uprooted. The art story alone is staggering. Works are taken for Hitler, for Göring, and for the machinery of plunder that passes under the name of official valuation. Some pieces are eventually recovered by advancing Allied armies, others vanish, and here the business story changes again. For the First World War, the family had already been less central to war finance than in earlier eras. By the Second World War, merchant bankers matter even less in the old sense. Governments in the Keynesian age manage war economies more directly. Allocation, production, demand, currency controls, these are now being handled on scales and through mechanisms that leave far less room for a house like Rothschild to play the old interstate transfer role. The family suffers immensely from the Nazi period, but not in a way that restores its old centrality. Their tragedy is personal, political, cultural, and financial. It is not the kind of crisis from which the old model can re-emerge stronger. Even their efforts to help Jewish refugees reflect the fractured and terrible nature of the moment. There are plans for financing emigration to Palestine. There are also proposals involving entirely different territories. There is hesitation, disagreement, and the painful reality that Europe is becoming murderous faster than many elites know how to respond. What this really shows is the final collapse of the 19th century Rothschild world. The old equation, wealth plus reputation plus transnational reach, can no longer secure a place in Europe once the state itself becomes openly genocidal. In part one, the family rose because it knew how to operate around states. In the 1930s and 1940s, there is no operating around this kind of state. The long afterlife. And yet, the story does not end in the ruins. One of the reasons this book works so well is that Ferguson does not confuse the end of Rothschild predominance with the end of Rothschild history. The family and the firm survive, but on altered terrain. After the war, the task is no longer to restore the 19th century order. That is impossible. The task is to find a viable role in a world where capital flows are increasingly shaped by the United States, decolonization, regulation, new corporate forms, and later globalization. Anthony's strategy, in broad terms, is to rebuild the bank's overseas business. That is not easy in a post-war world where major capital flows often move from America toward Europe rather than the other way around. But the family does find defensible niches. Gold remains one of them. This feels historically fitting. Even after changes in the post-war monetary system, and even after the stresses that break the old gold pool, the Rothschilds retain a major place in bullion dealing. They operate not only in London, but in New York, Hong Kong, and Singapore. Their old connection to the precious metal world becomes one of the threads that carries continuity across radically different eras. They also move into areas that would have sounded quite distant from the old stereotype of the family bank. There is investment in television. There are positions in natural resources that become especially important in Australia. There is adaptation to a more corporate, advisory, post-imperial financial world. Then, in the late 20th century, something especially interesting happens. The bank becomes one of the leading advisors in the privatization wave. This is one of the places where Ferguson draws a beautiful historical parallel. The 19th century Rothschilds helped create a truly international market for government debt. The late 20th century Rothschilds helped manage a massive transfer of assets from the public to the private sector. In other words, the firm once again finds a role in reorganizing the relationship between state property, investor capital, and global markets. That does not mean everything is easy. The family is at a disadvantage in some areas because of its link to Israel. The Arab League's blacklist is a reminder that geopolitics and identity still matter. Multinational structure brings risks of its own, as later episodes like the Zurich crisis show. But even here the old family logic partly holds, and that is where the Barings comparison becomes so satisfying. In the 1990s, Barings is destroyed by a rogue trader and absorbed by ING Rothschild, by contrast, survives. That does not mean it dominates as it once did. It means it still knows how not to die. That sounds modest, but in banking history it is a very large achievement. By the late 1990s, the world Ferguson describes is one in which giant international corporations seem to dwarf both nation-states and family firms. On paper, that ought to make a house like Rothschild look obsolete, and yet the family bank still exists, still has global reach, and still retains its independence in a financial world that has swallowed many older names. That is where Ferguson's final explanation becomes so persuasive. The deepest strength of the family was not occult influence or perfect foresight. It was a durable ethic, unity, morality, work, caution, long horizons, and the ability to absorb shocks without seeking spectacular short-term gain. He gives those qualities the old Latin compression, concordia, integritas, industria, and the underlying point is strong. The Rothschilds lasted because they were built to survive a bad century, not just enjoy a good decade. That, to me, is the real ending of the book. Not triumph, not collapse, survival after scale,